There are countless YouTube videos about self-development, and it's not unusual to hear pieces of advice that are contradicting. One person says this, while another says the complete opposite. Then you also have paradoxes. You have to understand X, while also accepting that Y, which appears to contradict X, is also true. These circumstances can create a lot of confusions, and worst case scenario, if you apply certain self-help advice without critical thinking, it could lead you in the total opposite direction of where you wanted to go. In this video, we'll discuss how to consume self-help content critically and tailor it to fit your own life circumstances. Make sure to watch until the end, as I'm going to give a personal example of how one advice almost stopped me in the beginning phases of my YouTube journey. The first point we're going to discuss is context of the advice. As I said in the intro, if you take self-help advice at face value, it will literally lead you to the opposite direction of where you want to go. All pieces of advice is context dependent. Context of which situation the advice should be applied in, context of the person giving it, and context of your unique life situation. Depending on the situation you're in, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, the advice is usually not the same. More often than not, the advice actually directly contradicts each other. Even advice for the same level, for example intermediate, can contradict each other because of the unique life context of certain people. After looking at the context of which situations the advice should be applied in, it is also wise to look at the context of the person giving the advice. Who is this person? What was the start point of their journey? And what challenges did they go through as a result of their background, journey, and challenges? Are there some pieces of advice from this person that is especially good? And are there some pieces of advice that might be biased? Some pieces of advice might also be true, but not applicable to your life circumstances. This brings me to the next point that I think is wise to look over: the context of you and your unique life situation. Where do you fit in this context? Are you a beginner, intermediate? Do you have some unique traits or life circumstances? If you seem to fit who the person is giving the advice to, it will probably work for you. But if you have some unique traits, mindsets, or life circumstances, this requires you to think more critically about the advice. Maybe you need to adjust some variables of the advice that is given. Maybe 80% of the advice will be applicable to you, and the remaining 20% needs to be adjusted to your unique traits and mindsets. This is something you need to play around and experiment with and figure out yourself. Now let's move on to the next main point, which is about theories in perfect conditions. A lot of people dismiss certain theories too prematurely. They say that this theory only works in perfect conditions, or that my life have this and that, so that theory wouldn't apply to me. But they're missing out on something really important. A lot of theories is actually presented in perfect conditions in the beginning. Let's take an example from economics. When they first teach you about the supply and demand curves, it's presented in perfect conditions, perfect competition, full information, no transaction cost, etc. After understanding theory in perfect conditions, then they'll start to apply constraints like not perfect competition, like monopoly, information asymmetry, etc. So even though the starting point in perfect conditions is not realistic, it is still very valuable because you get to understand the ideal situation and you get to understand the variables in perfect conditions. And when you have this base understanding, it's easier to understand how certain constraints are going to affect the variables. Have a base understanding of the theory in perfect conditions, and then you can make it more realistic by applying your own life constraints and see how that will affect the variables for the theory. Next up is a personal example of how one advice could have significantly slowed down my YouTube progress, or worst case scenario, made me give up my YouTube journey if I didn't understand the concepts that we just discussed. In the beginning phases of my YouTube journey, I had a goal of trying to put out one video a week. And to be able to do that, I often had to divide my videos into parts. Part 1 for 1 week, part 2 for the next week, etc. As I said, I was a beginner, so I didn't have the skill and the systems to be able to create one full video a week. After putting out a few videos, I actually reached out to somebody, and this somebody gave me the advice that I should make a full video instead of dividing it into parts. After a lot of thought, I ended up not following his advice. Yes, creating one full video might attract more views, but as a beginner, I knew that it was more valuable for me to learn the process of creating one video a week. And every time I go through this process, I get better. I refine my process. I refine my systems. I get more efficient. And these lessons are much more valuable to me as a beginner than the extra views I would have gotten from making a full video. If I followed his advice, I probably would have been able to put out one video a month. And I probably would have been mad at myself for not being able to put out one video a week. And I can definitely see this leading me to quitting YouTube. Now, was the advice bad? Well, it depends on the context. If you're an intermediate or advanced in YouTube, I think this advice is really good. But if you're a beginner, I think this advice is terrible. As a beginner, you should just learn to create one video a week, get in the habit of doing it. If you focus too much on detail and quality and get too caught up with perfectionism, you're most likely going to get paralyzed and overwhelmed. Worst case scenario, you might even give up. Now, this was an example of creating YouTube videos, but this concept is also true for a lot of other areas. When you're first starting out on something, you often just want to get in the habit of showing up. If focusing too much on quality paralyzes you and prevents you from showing up, you're probably focusing too much on quality. Only after mastering the habit of showing up, the fundamentals, when it's ingrained in you, when it's almost unconscious, when you know that shifting your focus would not affect your habit of showing up, that is when you can allow yourself to shift your focus to quality. I hope you enjoyed that video, guys. And if you're new here, make sure to hit the subscribe button, or you can check out the next video that is linked here first. And lastly, if you're interested in diving deeper into these topics, get my free to-do list template, or you just want to get to know me better, check out my free newsletter that is linked below. That is all for now. See you in the next video.